Hello, everyone, and welcome everyone to another Biassa webinars. I'm Carlos Monteiro, and we are really thrilled to have Lindsay today on our show. Lindsay Lair, if that is correct. Yeah.
That is correct. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And we have here today with me Rafael.
Hello, Rafael from Biassa.
And Lamprini as well. Our new member has been working with us now for some time.
Hi, Lamprini, also from Biassa.
Great. And I just want to make a quick intro about this webinar, which is going to be awesome. We have high caliber material. It's going to be about the e-commerce in Brazil. And Lindsay is the Senior Director for AMI, which stands for America's Market Intelligence. And she's a North American. And highly experienced in the Latin American market. So Lindsay, welcome. And I think it would be very nice if you could do like a quick intro about yourself, and then we start talking about the e-commerce in Brazil and its potential. I'm really looking forward to sharing this with our audience as well. So.
Great. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Carlos. Thank you to all for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. E-commerce in Brazil is a subject I've been studying and learning about intensively for the past 2 years, more or less, and have really accumulated a lot of knowledge, and I'm very happy to share it. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, and I will do a little introduction of who I am, what our firm is, to give you guys some background. As Carlos mentioned, we're here today to talk about opportunities in Brazil's e-commerce market. Across the world, Brazil is known as a very exciting and opportune place to do business, despite some of the news that we've heard in the past year in Brazil. So we're going to get into the details of that. But before we do, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background about our firm and myself so you have some context. America's Market Intelligence, we call ourselves the leading independent market intelligence provider in Latin America. Now, what does that mean? Market intelligence refers to information that companies need to make good strategic decisions. And our firm, we're a consulting and market research firm specialized in Latin America. We have offices in Miami. I'm based in San Francisco. We also have offices in Mexico and Brazil, and a very vast network of contractors to give us full regional coverage. And we're on the ground doing research, talking to experts in order to give our clients, who tend to be North American and European companies, the insights into that local market to be able to make smart business decisions and compete in the region. So our services are very broad, as you can imagine, but really we act as strategic partners. AMI works across a number of industries. Payments, however, is our largest, and it's really my area of specialization. I've been working very closely and intensively in the payments industry over the past 2 years, and what we've really seen from our clients and in the region is a very intense transition towards everything digital. So we've been studying e-commerce, m-commerce, digital wallets, NFC, everything that is bringing financial services to smartphones and to the digital world. And then just to give you some background on myself, I've been interested in Latin America for many, many years, very passionate about Spanish, Portuguese. I lived in Buenos Aires, Argentina for about 5 years and have traveled all over the region. Been doing this work now for 4 years with AMI, and am enjoying this industry more and every day as it changes very rapidly.
Lindsay, do you speak Portuguese or Spanish?
Falo as duas coisas, né? Português não tão bom como espanhol, mas mais ou menos.
Very good. Maybe you should do.
That was very impressive.
Oh, my Portuguese, I've been to Brazil many times. My Portuguese is okay. It gets me by. It's not as polished as I would like it to be, but it's okay. So let's go ahead and get into some of the content that we're going to be speaking about today. The first thing I'm going to do is just set the stage for us. Brazil, as I mentioned, is a very exciting market in many ways, and we're going to look into some of those details. So if we go to the next slide. Now, I'm not exactly sure who is in our audience today. I understand that it's mostly, decision makers for companies and in Europe interested in Latin America. Brazil certainly has a very important profile on the global stage. It's the sixth largest economy in the world, the 10th largest e-commerce market in the world, and has really gained fame in the past 5 or so years as a very exciting and dynamic emerging market. Let's look at the numbers a little bit for e-commerce. We've got a total market size of about 23 billion, 39 million e-shoppers, 550,000 online merchants. Brazil is a very exciting market because it's big, it's relatively middle income, and Brazilians are hungry, excited consumers. They're early technology adopters, and they love new shiny products, especially those coming from outside of Brazil. On the global stage, compared to China and the U.S., we've got, a relatively small market. But if we look compared to Latin America, here we see represented Mexico at 7 billion, Argentina at 5, Colombia at 5, Peru at 2. So Brazil really dwarfs the rest of the region. And people tend to see the Latin America region as an entire region, right? As one big block, right? And that's, not so accurate. Every country is very different. And so it's very important to choose which market to go into first, very strategically. And of course, Brazil is by far the largest market, so it's very attractive in many ways. And it's arguably a more complex and difficult market. So if you're able to get into Brazil, take advantage of that large market size, and kind of climb that learning curve, the rest, moving into Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, is going to be a lot easier for you after you've had that first Latin America experience in Brazil.
And just a quick question then. Do you think that because of Brazil, because Brazil, not because Brazil poses so many challenges, but do you think that these other countries, let's say at least in South America as well, they're looking at, are the upcoming trends existing in Brazil, and they try to adopt that as well? So do you see Brazil as a trendsetter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Brazil, it's kind of like everything that happens, what we say is everything that happens in Latin America, in the U.S., gets to Brazil and Mexico 2 or 3 years later, right? So Brazil and to a lesser extent, but also Mexico, are early adopters of, trends that we're seeing in the U.S. and North America. As soon as you have an exciting startup in Silicon Valley, 2 years later, you're going to have a similar model, but Brazilian style or Mexican style. And then after that, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Chile tend to be 2 or 3 years behind Brazil and Mexico. So it's really, to understand what's going to happen next in Latin America, you can look to Brazil, see what technologies are succeeding, what areas are growing, what the challenges are, and kind of project what that's going to look like in the rest of the region. Great. Okay, so if we look a little bit more in detail into what this $23 billion market looks like, we see that retail takes up about 50% of all e-commerce sales. This is, pretty standard when we think about global e-commerce markets. Retail is also where we have the most data. It's the most easily accessible, and so we're able to break it down into these product categories. Fashion and cosmetics. Brazilians are notorious for being very excited about fashion, accessories, cosmetics, personal care. But we also see a really high percentage of expensive goods, so smartphones, computers, laptops, other electronics, furniture, and home appliances. These are big categories that are continuing to grow pretty rapidly. Compared to 2014, we see these categories, mobile phones and home appliances and electronics, gaining share compared to other categories. But there's a lot less market information about these two other parts of the e-commerce market, which is travel and services. And very interesting for Brazil right now is digital goods and services, especially for international merchants who, digital goods are very attractive to export because you don't have to ship anything. It's very easy for someone in another country to download your content, access your service. It's very and Brazilians, who have the very high penetration of smartphones, the highest in Latin America, are very eager consumers of digital goods and services. So right now it's at about $4 billion, growing in the triple digits, and this is really where we're going to see a very exciting transformation in Brazil over the next couple of years, and I'm going to get to that in more detail.
All right.
Okay, let's go ahead. So now I've talked about how exciting Brazil is, how big and dynamic the economy is. Of course, we have to address what's currently going on in Brazil, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. Brazil is currently going through its worst recession since the 1930s. The economy is expected to shrink between 3 and 4% this year. It also shrank last year. And that comes, I'm not going to go into, that's a whole other presentation of why and how this is occurring in Brazil. But what's important to understand is that Brazil is experiencing a lot of negative economic ailments. So, they've lost 50% of their value of the real, the local currency against the dollar in the past couple of years. We're seeing high inflation, increasing interest rates, very high unemployment, around 10%, and pretty much stagnated consumer spending when we're looking at the economy as a whole. And that's something that is in the news on a regular basis. President is going through impeachment. Brazil is in flux right now. It's a hard time to be in Brazil and to make money in Brazil right now. But what is very important to understand, and what I want to call your attention to, is this bar graph at the bottom of the slide. Despite these challenging times that have been going on in Brazil really since 2013, we see that e-commerce is growing year over year, an average of 20% since 2011. It's pretty remarkable considering more traditional sectors of the economy. The automotive industry shrank 25% last year. Traditional retail, brick and mortar retail, shrank 5% last year. So the fact that e-commerce is still growing in the double digits is quite exciting and paints a very optimistic picture. If we go to the next slide, we're going to break down growth a little bit to understand really what's driving it. So if you look at this red line in the upper left chart here, growth in 2015 for e-commerce was about 15%. Now it is decelerating. Growth is starting to slow a little bit, and that's a reflection of two things. Number one, of course, e-commerce is not totally insulated from economic crisis in Brazil. This year, e-commerce is really going to be a channel available to the upper middle and upper class, people who still have plenty of purchasing power. The lower middle class and middle class are dropping out of that a little bit because of the difficult circumstances they're in. That's one reason why growth is decelerating. But another reason is that it's just the market is maturing. The market has already been going strong for about 10 years, and we're starting to reach a level of maturity in which we're seeing growth slow a little bit. However, if you look at this gray box in the chart to the right, we see mobile sales via the mobile channel are growing at 88%. Now, that's interesting because that reflects retail sales only. And of course, retail is not necessarily the most convenient product category for mobile because you have to enter in your payment information. It's uncomfortable. You have to ship a physical good. People tend to like to sit at their computer, take their time to make a purchase online. So if we include in that category everything that is developing in the app economy, so I'm referring to Uber, Easy Taxi, transportation, food delivery, digital content, streaming, downloads, music, everything that is much more apt and conducive to being consumed on the mobile channel, if we include that in that growth rate, that's going to be at well over 100%. Could be 2%, could be 250%. Those numbers no one has actually really generated. But we can be very confident that mobile is going to drive growth in e-commerce for the next 3 to 5 years.
So if anyone wants to invest in e-commerce in Brazil right now, then definitely should not leave the mobiles out of it.
Exactly, Hafa. So if you go to the next slide, just kind of some key takeaways of this section, you hit it really correctly, is that, just to give some very clear points here, 2016 is going to be Brazil's worst year in decades. And we're not going to expect growth to resume until 2018, okay? But given that, even though we're having a very difficult circumstances in Brazil, e-commerce is still growing at a very healthy 15% per year. On top of that, mobile growth is growing more than 100% in certain circumstances. So what does that mean for international merchants? Now, it's very understandable if international merchants who maybe don't understand Latin America so well, Brazil is still kind of this nebulous thing that that is very strange to them. It would make sense to want to wait until 2018 and take advantage of this time to gear up, to educate yourself, to climb that learning curve and prepare for market entry late 2017, 2018. Merchants who are very excited about Brazil, who see it as an emerging market, that they don't want to miss the opportunity, that they see that there is growth despite, the situation at the moment. Merchants entering right now must have a very targeted mobile strategy to drive and capture sales via the mobile channel. This is very important. And if you're more interested in learning about that, on the subtitle here, I have a link to another presentation on our website that is dedicated to the mobile commerce environment in Latin America and best practices on how to develop that strategy specifically for Latin America. So, all right, we've covered why Brazil is so exciting and why international merchants should take Brazil seriously. Now we need to get into the nuts and bolts of how to do that and some of the challenges that we may face. And this is a very, very important section that I really want to sink in. And if I'm going too fast, please interrupt me because it's very important that everyone understands what I'm talking about. Certainly in e-commerce, understanding the payment structure and billing your clients is the most important part, because if you can't collect payment, you can't sell. And so that's a crucial component.
I'm sorry, I'm just laughing because one of my clients, we took like nearly 6 months. I mean, we established a company in Brazil for them, and opening the bank account was by far the most challenging thing ever. And they were asking me, but why can't the merchants pay online? I mean, you can do that all over the globe, and I mean, you can do that in Brazil, but for two reasons, we're seeing a lot of rejections. The first reason is that they use a merchant here called Braintree, which is part of PayPal. And for some reason, the Braintree rejects a lot of the payments coming from Brazil. And one of the reasons that they argue is that there are a lot of frauds in Brazil. But the second reason why it's not a good idea, and I think you're going to touch that point also, it's because, I mean, the service gets not competitive, because there is the client has to pay nearly 40% or sometimes 50% in taxes, as the Brazilian government cannot tax the company who's selling the service, in another country. So who ends up paying the bill is the client. So sorry.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's great to have some commentary from an actual experience, on the ground. And there are just dozens of cases, just like you explained, Carlos, that merchants who are trying to go into Brazil and just having poor results. And so I'm going to explain why that is and some strategies to avoid that. But first, I want to really clarify some terminology. I'm going to use the word cross-border a lot. Cross-border, the dictionary definition, cross-border means a transaction in which two parties are in different countries. Okay, that's this very simple definition. But from a payments perspective, we need to think about who's processing the credit card transaction, who's capturing that transaction. Most international merchants are going to be using an international acquirer, an international bank like Braintree, like Chase, like First Data, like Barclays. These are global companies, global banks that are processing transactions globally, but outside of the local economy wherever the payment is taking place. On the other hand, we've got Brazilian acquirers, Brazilian banks, who, if the card payment is being captured through a Brazilian bank, that's considered a local transaction. So I'm going to refer a lot to local and cross-border. So that's really what I'm talking about. As we mentioned, it's very common to have a cross-border strategy. So eBay, Amazon, Macy's, Best Buy, all of these big merchants, they don't necessarily have a targeted Brazilian strategy. And so, a Brazilian customer might go onto Amazon, try to make a purchase, but it's the same Amazon site, the global site that we see from any country. Booking.com, they even have a Brazilian Portuguese website, but they're still using cross-border banks. They're not using Brazilian banks, so it's still considered a cross-border transaction. It's only local if the transaction is going through a local bank. So Cielo Hedge, these two acquirers are the biggest ones in the market. They control about 85% to 90% of all credit card transactions in Brazil. JetNet and Stone are up-and-coming players that are starting to compete with the major players and gain some market relevance. So just to give you some background. If we go to the next slide. What I really want to get across is that merchants using a cross-border strategy are only accessing the very tip of the iceberg. If you look at this bar chart at the bottom, only $4 billion of Brazilian e-commerce is cross-border. And so if you're not plugging into local Brazilian banks, you are forfeiting access to $19 billion in addressable market. Okay, if you're not plugging into Brazilian banks, it is impossible for you to access that chunk of the market. And that chunk of the market are Brazilian customers using Brazilian credit cards to buy on Brazilian merchants. And if you're not in that, if you're not playing in that space, you're forfeiting a huge opportunity. Now, in the next couple slides, at the top of the box here, 1 through 4, these are the reasons why a cross-border approach is not ideal. Okay, it has to do with taxes, it has to do with the local payment methods and the local payment systems, the peculiarities of the Brazilian payment structure, and we're going to look at that in more detail. But does that make sense so far?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, great.
Very much, very much.
Great. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, here really what this slide is very dense with information, and I'm going to walk us through it. It's very important to understand each component. So one of the first reasons that cross-border does not work in Brazil is this first bar chart on the upper left. There are about 80 million active credit cards in Brazil. Mm-hmm. But what is strange for me in the U.S., this took me some time to really understand how this works. Only 20% of cards issued in Brazil are enabled for international purchases. Right. So even if you have a Visa or a MasterCard, your bank may not allow you to make international purchases. That doesn't really exist in the U.S., so I'm not sure about Europe, but it may be difficult for people to understand or to really grasp. But 80% of Brazilian credit cards can only be used in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have a local processing capacity, you're not able to sell to 80% of Brazilian credit cards. Okay, that's number one, and that's already really huge.
That's a very interesting point.
If you look at the pie chart to the right here, this breaks down e-commerce sales by payment type in terms of total spend. So this red slice here refers to international credit cards. Only 22% of all e-commerce spend is purchased using an international credit card. That means 80% of the market is using some other payment method. And if you don't have a local presence, you cannot accept those local payment methods. So exactly. You've got about 50% of the market, the payment method is a domestic credit card. You've got Visa, you've got MasterCard, and you've also got Brazilian credit card schemes, which are growing and gaining popularity. And then, the pink and the gray, you've got about 30% of the market that are not card transactions at all. They're what we call alternative payments that are non-card cash-based payments. And this is also very different from the U.S. That really doesn't exist at any large scale in the U.S. So it's hard for a lot of merchants to understand even what a non-card payment looks like. And you guys who are Brazilian can attest to this. If we look to the bottom here, we have this little barcode, boleto bancário, which is a very, very common, you guys know this very well, it's an extremely common payment method in Brazil. And, we refer to it, simply as boleto. It's basically an invoice that you print out and pay for at a later date. So if I'm a Brazilian, I'm going to Netshoes, which is a very popular retailer of sporting goods and shoes. I'm going to buy some running shoes. I go to checkout. I select boleto bancário as my payment method. I print out an invoice with a barcode, and I have about 48 hours to take that invoice to a bank, to a supermarket, to a lottery agency, millions of locations in Brazil, and pay in cash. And merchants often think, well, that seems like a very inefficient way to collect payment. And it may be if you're coming from a North American or European context, but it is absolutely 100% normal in Brazil. And about 23% of all e-commerce is paid for with a boleto bancário. So it's a very important payment method if you want to reach the full Brazilian audience. And it's very important to understand that about 50 million Brazilians don't have a bank account. They have no electronic payment method. They have no way to access e-commerce other than boleto bancário. So it's very important to incorporate that into your e-commerce payment methods.
Lindsay, just another thing to maybe add to your presentation is it's with regards to B2B, because this is really like from a
That's a very good
B2C
point.
standpoint, but also when you're doing business with other businesses, I mean, other businesses in Brazil, they want to have the convenience of paying to a local bank, so they want to get this barcode paper, right? The boleto bancário, kind of like a boleto bancário, and just pay in another bank instead of using their credit cards. And that's another thing that our client here in Denmark didn't really understand. But the businesses in Brazil, they want to have this convenience, and also because, for example, the manager at this specific company, it's a large fashion retailer. He said, "I don't want to use my card. I mean, why do I have to be using, So just adapt."
That's a really good point, Carlos. I mean, in the U.S., I know this is not so much the case in Europe, but in the U.S., we're so used to swiping our card for everything. It's a behavior that's very ingrained. We love our cards. We love our miles and our points. It's not like that in Latin America. People are not married to their credit cards like we are here. Oftentimes, they're afraid of putting their credit card information online. It's just a cultural thing that has not quite been fully adopted yet. Credit limits are very low. So if you're trying to buy a laptop, you may not have the credit limit available on your card. Oftentimes, credit limits are only $500. And so if you're trying to buy an international flight or something, a piece of furniture, you may not be able to do that with your credit card. And boleto bancário is a convenient alternative to that. It really works well, in the market structure that exists in Brazil.
Correct. Very nice.
Okay. We can go on to the next slide here. So this is just I don't know how clearly everyone can see this, but I just wanted to give you some examples of very famous international merchants that are using local payment methods in Brazil. We've got Groupon. The first things we see are Visa and MasterCard. We then see Elo, which is a local Brazilian credit card. And then below that, we've got a variety of local payment methods. We've got online bank transfers, which I didn't even touch on, which is another common payment method. And then finally, we've got boleto bancário at the bottom. Okay, Spotify, they are at the moment only accepting credit cards, but these last three icons are Brazilian credit cards that are growing and are becoming very, nearing about 10 to 15% market share overall, and are not accessible if you're not processing locally. Adidas, at the bottom, they're accepting major credit cards, and then also at the very bottom right, you see the boleto bancário logo. So we've got, Groupon is a coupon company, you've got digital goods, and you've got a traditional retailer, all incorporating these strategies into their sales in Brazil. Now, the final thing that I really want to touch on in Brazil, the Brazilian payment scheme, is what we call parcelamento, which is very difficult for international merchants to wrap their heads around, but is an absolute cornerstone of the Brazilian shopping experience. And you guys, again, can attest to this. What is a parcelado? It is an interest-free installment plan that is made available to the consumer when they make the purchase. So it's different from choosing to make payments month to month on your credit card. If I go into a traditional, brick and mortar store, electronics store in Brazil, and I'm buying a computer, the cashier will ask me, how many payments do you want to make this in? And Brazilians are very, very used to paying in from 3 up to 12 installments completely interest-free.
Mhm.
And even for goods priced as low as 150 reais or for about $40, and that really blows merchants' minds when they think, well, how do they do this? How is it even worth it to them? It's worth it to them because if you look at this last bullet here, almost 60% of e-commerce sales last year were made using an installment plan, and that's equal to about $13 billion. So it's absolutely crucial to have a site that looks and feels like a Brazilian site and makes a Brazilian shopper feel comfortable. Now, it is an added expense to merchants. They have to pay higher fees to the acquirers to enable merchants, and you often have to, work with your reconciliation and finance team to make that work with your cash flow. But it's a worthwhile investment, considering how much how much Brazilians demand, especially now when purchasing power is a little more restricted. People maybe don't have the cash up front. They want to be able to pay over the course of a year. And so if we look at these examples, I know it's hard to tell, but if in the little like in the first one, this is at the Nike store, the last line of the little text, you see 10x, and that's basically referring to the fact that you can pay in up to 10 installments interest free. The smartphone is at Walmart in Brazil. You also, right under the 549, you see the 10x again, meaning you can pay in 10 installments of 549 reais. This last one over here is a travel Despegar, a travel aggregator. That little line at the bottom, até 10 vezes, you can pay up to 10 in 10 installments interest-free. So just a couple of examples of very big, well-known merchants who are doing this. And I don't know if you guys want to comment on that and kind of give us the Brazilian taste of how common and important parcelamento is.
I kind of like, at least for my opinion, it's just like I forgot about this when living in Europe. I mean, people don't do this.
Exactly.
And I really loved doing this when I was in Brazil, but it's actually, it's funny because, I mean, you always have this incentive to buy something new, and then you really have to be aware of your budget, your habits,
Yeah.
your spending habits.
I also would go with a personal comment of mine, which ever since I moved to Europe, it felt really different because we are educated in Brazil that we can consume things, a lot of things, just by paying installments. So you can buy 10 to 15 different things in a month, but you don't pay them fully. You pay them over time. So I don't know. It's a little bit crazy. I don't know how people manage to do that, but that's how we were educated.
Well,
to do.
it is a little bit crazy, and it does get you into trouble. Brazil is over indebted, and at the moment, Brazilians are very wary of taking on additional debt because of the past several years of overspending. So it does have, in the U.S. we talk about. Certainly, we've all have experience with crises based on over indebtedness. And this is very common not only in Brazil but all of Latin America. The beauty of it is that it has enabled Latin Americans to gain access to goods and services that they would never gain access to, and become more international. So international flights, technology, all of these tools that countries need to be brought into the global economy, these countries have been able to access where they may not have at the same rate in the past. So it's definitely has its pros and cons. But for a merchant, if you're able to set up your cash flow and your finance department to accommodate this, you're going to see your sales increase.
Substantially,
perhaps
yeah.
Substantially, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're also going to see more merchandise moving. So your stock flow is going to move a lot faster if you enable this.
Absolutely, you have to be agile and ready to make that happen. And even for digital goods and services, this works. Anything over really 100, 150 reais, definitely for travel, for online courses, anything that is, many digital goods are pretty affordable and very cheap. But if you have anything that is a little more expensive,
like a course.
Exactly, like an online course, or something, or a software, something that's in B2B software is something that's very important. So that kind of thing is as equally important for digital goods providers as well. Okay. If we take the next slide here, just to wrap this up in terms of key takeaways for payments and e-commerce in Brazil. Again, I don't want to stress this enough. Using a cross-border strategy only is not good enough. Brazil is too big and too competitive a market to, take it lying down. You really need a proactive Brazilian localized strategy to enable local payment methods, to enable interest payments, and also just to make your site look and feel comfortable for Brazilian shoppers. There's so many options for e-commerce out there. If someone isn't able to make a payment conveniently, or if your site looks and feels foreign, they're going to go with the competition. So it's very crucial to a successful strategy to have a payment checkout system that is comfortable and convenient for shoppers. Okay, so we've talked about how great Brazil is. We've talked about how important it is to have a local strategy. So how on earth do we do it? Now, as Carlos was mentioning, this is where things get a little stressful for merchants often, because in many cases, and as far as many merchants understand, having a local strategy, plugging into local banks, requires you to open a local entity in Brazil. Okay, and this is a very complex, costly, complicated process. You first need to register with a local tax authority, open a Brazilian bank account, and then hire a local payment gateway or service provider to integrate you with the local banks. And as Carlos gave a great anecdote, this is can be a very hard process. Brazil has a terrible, very complicated tax regime, endless paperwork, red tape. Getting money out of Brazil is very expensive and difficult. There are all these hurdles, regulatory hurdles that merchants face, and this deters people. They say, look, this is too much of a headache. This is too difficult. I don't have the support I need to really understand what I'm doing. I'm not going to do it. So that's, sometimes that's a big challenge, and what I'm trying to bring to the table through this webinar, through other reports, and through my consulting is that it doesn't have to be this way, and merchants have a lot of options. So if we go to the next slide, this is maybe the biggest message I want people to come away with today, is that despite the fact that Brazil is hard to do business in, it's hard to go there, it's hard to set up a local entity, merchants have options. And this is something that is not well understood at all internationally. It's not always required to have a local entity. Or you can have a local entity with a very light footprint in Brazil without actually being...
Yeah, basically like a sales office, sorry.
Or a sales office, or even, you don't even, in some cases, you don't even need any office. You just need to be officially registered, but you don't even need to be there necessarily. And in some cases, you don't need to be there at all, depending on what provider you're working with. So at the bottom of this slide, I've listed a few of the payment gateways and service providers available in Brazil. But there are more than 20 good providers who offer a wide range of services for international merchants. So, international services maybe they're really only focused on local Brazilian merchants. They may be extremely specialized in international digital goods providers. They maybe have a business model that enables merchants to sell locally in Brazil without ever stepping foot in the country. There are lots of options and a big support system for merchants who want to sell into Brazil that merchants they're not necessarily aware of. And so that's a message that I really want to communicate, and that there are a lot of resources available to help merchants go through this process. These are like 5 examples of the most well-known payment gateways in Brazil, but it's extremely important to do very good due diligence when choosing a provider, because there are many options that merchants may not be aware of, and it's very important to choose the one that is correct for your vertical, for your country of origin, your industry, your size. And so that's a process that really requires and deserves a lot of time and investment.
I have a question for you, Lindsay. This year, the Brazilian government, they, because of so much debt, they have resurrected a very old taxation system which is the interstate taxation. That is, it's been really, it has been seen very difficult for the e-commerce, the local e-commerce. How do you see that as compared compared to the cross-border payments to a
I'm
local
not.
provider?
Can you? I'm not. I'm not very aware of that actually. The interstate tech. Can you explain it a little
Yeah,
more?
the CMS. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever you sell goods, for example, say your company is based in São Paulo and you have a
Mm.
customer in the north of Brazil, and you have to ship it over there. So you have to collect taxes
Okay.
because each state has a different tax
Sure.
amount. So you have to collect the taxes and pay for both of them.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, Brazilians are unfortunately very accustomed to paying a lot of tax. Brazilian customers, certainly that is going to be an additional burden on your customers. But it's not unique to e-commerce. It's going to be spread throughout the economy, and Brazilians are used to that and are able to swallow it more so than perhaps other countries.
Hmm.
That's also perhaps an even greater incentive for digital goods merchants to get in the market now, and for retailers to perhaps wait a couple years and to see where the market is going to go. But that's not going to apply to digital goods. And digital goods, especially that are able to be consumed through the mobile channel, are really going to be they're pretty well protected from all of these regulations and
Hmm.
and barriers that the government is putting in place. So I would say that now that's even more evidence that now is a really great time for service providers of digital goods.
Hmm.
I would just say that also, just to complement your answer, Lindsay, that there is a strong now, I would say, positive lobby from the e-commerce association in Brazil to put a barrier to
Mm-hmm.
this new taxes that were appearing, because what happens in Brazil, as Rafa said, is that we have different zones. So you have the north region, the south region, and southeast region, and each one of the regions, they are so for example, the southeast region in Brazil is the wealthiest region in the country. So
Mm-hmm.
there are some different tax schemes, and what was happening was that whenever a company in São Paulo would sell their goods to someone located in the north, the state in São Paulo would be benefited by the 18%
Mm.
of taxes. But then the different state, the state in the north also wanted their share of taxes. And so, I mean, this is pretty unfair, especially to the merchant, because they would have to repass the price to
Sure.
the consumer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what was going on is I went to a conference in Brazil in January, and there was a huge discussion about it, because some
Mm.
companies like Magazine Luiza, they simply said, okay, they're really like large companies in Brazil, so they stopped selling to specific states in Brazil.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
everybody was being punished, like the state, the consumers, and the companies. But because it's a
Mm-hmm.
big company, then they can have they can say we are not selling to this specific state. So
Wow, that's
there's a
interesting.
huge, yeah, there's a huge
Well,
movement to
mhm.
change that. Sorry.
Oh no, and I was just going to say that may even provide an incentive to international merchants who are not
Hmm.
going to have that same taxation locally. They're going to be taxed when their goods come into the country, but Brazilians are already very used to that. Cross-border, even though the local currency has been dropping in value month after month, remarkably, international e-commerce has been growing at 15, 17% per year, and so,
Hmm.
and that's due to a couple of things. I mean, goods can often be cheaper even with the additional taxes you have to pay, goods are often cheaper outside of
Mm-hmm.
Brazil, and the supply, the variety of goods available is greater. So, we've had a lot of investment from Chinese e-commerce sites coming into Brazil. They've
Mhm.
really started to transform cross-border e-commerce. Of course, the U.S. is a huge market, and so that internal taxation may even provide greater incentive for international merchants to
Mm-hmm.
take advantage of that, because they're going to be cheaper. But Brazilians are already used to paying those importation taxes, and so if they're saying, look, if I to buy something in Brazil that's already more expensive, may not be as good as what
Exactly.
I can get abroad, and I have
Uh,
to pay additional state taxes, I'm just going to go with my supplier in China or Europe or the U.S. That may be
mm-hmm.
even greater incentive.
Mhm. I think it's also worth to mention that Brazil has lifted the cap for taxation for imported goods. So it used to be around $50. It's now $100.
Mm-hmm.
So anything below $100, they don't pay any tax when they come into the country, which is really good.
Yeah.
It's good news.
Yeah, and that's really going to benefit low-cost retailers from China, for example, who are
Exactly.
just,
Hmm.
Alibaba and AliExpress and Deal Extreme and a lot of these companies, these marketplaces that, I mean, obviously China is famous for low-cost goods, and through a very interesting payment strategy, they've been able to really penetrate the Brazilian market in an unprecedented way. So it's just really good points, and
Mm-hmm.
that are showcasing what's occurring right now.
Hmm.
Okay, so just to go to the next slide here, this is a case study. Unfortunately, I can't reveal the name of the company. They wanted to remain anonymous, but basically they are an internet domain registrar and web hosting company, very strong globally in the U.S. and Europe particularly, and they wanted a payment provider to help them sell locally in Brazil and all of Latin America. They saw that as an emerging market that had tons of potential for growth, because growth, that you need to go to emerging markets for growth. U.S. and Europe are already very mature in many ways. So, going to South America, going to Latin America is a common strategy to continue growing your business. But to do that, they needed a reliable payment provider who was able to give access to local payment methods and create a localized experience. AstroPay is sort of a lesser known company. They're
Mm-hmm.
based out of Uruguay, present in 7 countries in Latin America. And their business model enables merchants to sell locally in Brazil without
Mm-hmm.
ever setting up a local entity. And this is a really novel, really kind of crazy idea that merchants aren't aware of. This is available. Whether or not they're the right provider for a particular merchant, obviously there's a lot of questions that go into that, but this is one option that many people are not aware of. So this company, this merchant, integrated with AstroPay and saw their overall transaction approval jump from below 40% to over 75%.
Mm-hmm.
So immediately. So imagine what that's going to do for your sales. That's going to be that makes a huge impact. They were able to deploy business in Brazil very quickly and efficiently because they did not have to set up a local entity. And the experience was so positive, they invested more resources to integrate with the full API, and which further improved their conversion rates on their website. And so, the main takeaway of this is that partnering with AstroPay and processing locally resulted in double-digit revenue growth in Brazil. And then they were able to springboard later into Mexico and Colombia with the same provider using the same strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Just
That's
one
great.
example of many, to give a little color to what we're talking about. Okay. And so then if we're kind of finishing up here, but basically if the audience today, if you all found this interesting, there's a lot of information here, right? Pretty dense content. But if this was interesting, if you'd like to know more, if this kind of piqued your curiosity, if we go to the next slide, Rafa, I'm very, very thrilled about something that we're going to be able to offer very soon. My firm, AMI, has been working on this for the past several months. Really, we're trying to address a critical need that we're seeing every day here in Silicon Valley. I'm approached by technology companies who say, look, I don't understand Brazil. I want to sell there, but I don't know how. Can you help me? And everyone globally is asking for this information. And so basically what we've done is brought together two main things. On the left here is a very detailed, a much more detailed account of Brazil's banking system, local payment methods, all of those peculiarities that we talked about. A much more detailed account of the models available to merchants for market entry around opening a local entity or not, merchant best practices, and an analysis of what type of strategy is going to be best depending on what type of merchant you are. And then even more important than that is this box on the right. What we've done is we've done in-depth interviews with 16 different payment gateways in Brazil who are offering services to local merchants and collecting all of these metrics. So how big are they? How fast are they growing? Their full suite of services offered. How experienced are they dealing with international merchants? What special services do they provide? Who are they best suited for? What types of market entry models do they support? What are their fees? What are their competitive advantages? So this report is going to be available next month. We're very, very excited to release it, and I'm just thrilled to be able to support merchants in this process, understanding the great opportunities that exist in Brazil and all of Latin America. And so if this was interesting to you, if you'd like to learn more, this could be a great resource for you. It's going to be about an 80-page report, extremely comprehensive, and it basically functions as a practical guide for merchants on how to develop an e-commerce strategy in Brazil.
Fantastic.
So that'll be available for anyone who's interested.
Lindsay, I would also like to ask you to leave your contacts. I mean, people can find you on LinkedIn. I mean, when we do the description of the video, we're going to give all the links and so on. So it would be great if you could. Yeah.
Absolutely. If go to the next slide. Yeah, so here we have all my contact information. I am more than happy. I'd be very excited. You guys heard from me this whole time. I'd love to hear from the audience, learn who you are and what your challenges are, what your pain points are, what you're interested in. Please feel free to email or call. I'm happy to engage in any way. Would really just love to learn. I have a lot of experience dealing with American merchants, not so much Europe. So I would love to learn about what the experience is like and what questions people have about Brazil and all of Latin America.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Lindsay, this report that you said is going to be available next month.
Yes.
Is this going to be available for download on your website? So shall people... What should people do if they want to find out? Should they subscribe to your channel?
Yes, that's a very good question. It will be available on our website. On our website, you can subscribe to our newsletter and join our mailing list. And so once that is available, we'll be sending out, an e-blast notification with a link to directly download it. It will be available for purchase, and so the pricing will all be there, listed and clear for people. And so, yes, go ahead and log on to our website. I don't have that listed right there, but it's basically americasmi.com. You can join our mailing list. You can contact me directly, and I can add you to our mailing list. And so then you'll be notified when that's available. And yeah.
That's great. Fantastic. Lindsay, thank you very much. It was
Thanks,
really, we're really happy
it's my pleasure, guys. I'm really
Thanks for me as well. I'm really excited.